could sit and be more informal, but I'm more comfortable standing and holding forth, I suppose. Thanks for being here. I want to say that it's great to be back in LA, in Southern California. I lived in LA, in Pasadena actually, for about a decade, from the late 1980s to the late 1990s, where I taught history at Caltech, California Institute of Technology. And yes, they do have historians, a few historians there. I left from there and went to another tech school, Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta. Before that, by the way, I should say I taught at Virginia Tech. So I have a hat trick.
The hat trick.
The only historian ever to teach at 3 technical universities in a row. I'm very proud of this record, which will probably never be broken. Thanks, Alex, for having me here. I really appreciate it. It's great to be back. It's great to be back at UCLA. In writing this book, Bound for Freedom, Black Los Angeles and Jim Crow America, I spent many fruitful and happy hours here in the libraries, and particularly the Young Research Library and Special Collections. Had great assistance from everyone there, and from Alva in particular, with the oral history program, which is just really one of the premier oral history programs in the nation and the world. It's so user-friendly and tremendous collection of rich life stories. So thank you, and thanks for being here today. Thanks to Kathy for good directions and for being here. And also thanks to all of you who showed up. It's a gorgeous Wednesday afternoon in Southern California.
Thursday.
It's a gorgeous, excuse me, back up. Gorgeous Thursday afternoon. And I'm jet lagged, and I know you have other places to be, so I'm grateful and delighted that you're here. What I'll do now is to tell you my plan, which is to give a brief reading from the introduction of the book, just a few paragraphs, page or two, to give everyone a sense of what the book is trying to achieve, what I was trying to do, some of the things that I wound up thinking about, and then I'll talk more informally about some of the things that I found, and then let's just open it up to discussion and your questions and comments, and so on. I've had the chance to meet some of you, not all of you. Welcome. So I'll start at the beginning. It's a very good place to start with the introduction. The first aspects. Think about American freedom. What does freedom mean? Who gets to be free and why? When people are not free, how do they get free? When they are free, how do they stay that way? For centuries, Americans from all walks of life have debated and fought over the answers to these questions. And the results of those conflicts have shaped who we are as a people and as a nation. Long after you finish reading this book, I hope you'll continue to think about freedom in the United States. That, in the largest sense, has been my aim in writing it. But sweeping questions do not make the best starting point for a study of freedom. Well, the very notion of freedom is a topic of enormous breadth and complexity, encompassing an entire universe of theoretical conundrums. Somehow I cannot get at freedom by starting with the big picture. I get lost in the abstractions. My historical research has always gravitated toward what is local and concrete. I've been drawn to the neighborhood, the corner store, the church pew, the city council. I've always wanted to understand how real people at the corner of First and Main saw their world. My approach to this book, I almost instinctively looked away from the universe of ideas inherent to freedom and tried to see how one group of people tried to get free in a particular place and time. The African American community of Los Angeles, California. in the half century before World War II, a period of vital importance to American race relations and urban West. The story of this community is fascinating in its own right, but I'd suggest that it also sheds light on the continuing dilemmas of race and freedom in America. It's fascinating because the city and its people were, in the first half of the 20th century, caught up in a unique drama. It's instructive because Los Angeles then was what most cities in the United States are now, including my own home city of Atlanta. A sprawling, multiracial place where the rules of the game and the hierarchies of power seem always in flux. When boosters in early 20th century Los Angeles insisted that Los Angeles was the city of the future, they spoke more truly than they knew. Looking back, we see ourselves. Although black people, Afro-Spaniards, founded the city in 1781, the community I examined here arose with modern Los Angeles, whose official birth was the real estate boom, the boom of the late 80s. Most African Americans in the city were migrants from the American South, where Jim Crow had black people by the throat. What they found in Los Angeles was an oddly half-free environment. Racial conditions were better there than in the South, and preferable also to what most blacks discovered in the cities of the North. Opportunities for economic advancement, home ownership, and social freedom were readily apparent. But so too were patterns of everyday racism that blocked African Americans every step of the way. Knowing they were not free enough, black Angelenos set out to change that. And therein lies the tale. The main actors in this book are the community leaders who kept fighting for equal opportunity and basic civil rights. Their sheer tenacity was their most striking characteristic. For them, civil rights was not a movement or a set of dramatic moments. It was instead a way of life. Indeed, that is the central theme of this book, civil rights as a way of life. Whatever their individual characteristics, black Angelenos were defined by law and by custom as a group, and that group designation denied them the privileges of first-class citizenship, but not necessarily indefinitely. They could and did draw upon their shared past and their group institutions to challenge the status quo. In short, as a group, they chose to get free and stay free, and their struggle became the central focus in their lives. When I began this project around 1990, it never occurred to me that I, a white American, could not understand the African American experience. After all, I was a trained historian whose craft supplies keys for all doors to the past. But as the years progressed and my knowledge deepened, it gradually became clear to me that something intangible about the black American past was beyond my understanding. In one sense, such a gap is a normal part of historical research. When historians journey to the past, they arrive as outsiders, as pilgrims, if you will, seeking paths into places that can no longer receive them. And although years of research and contemplation give historians intimate familiarity with lost worlds, some separation between past and present is a normal part of the outcome. But the intangible I'm talking about here is something different, something linked to centuries of American slavery, to the traumas of Jim Crow, to the historical disconnect between the ideal of freedom and the realities of racism. In the America we live in, I've come to doubt that any white person, or any non-black person for that matter, can fully understand the African American experience. Some doors cannot be opened, as the author Dieta Demaritis recently wrote, after struggling unsuccessfully to imagine the feelings of a slave woman seeing her husband auctioned off to another white plantation family, quote, "There are places of pain I cannot enter," unquote. But I cannot fully understand and comprehend what it means to have been or to be a black person seeking freedom in America. I feel a strong obligation to try, for our pasts are of a piece. And if only African Americans can fathom what anti-black racism has done to the soul, it is also true that most Americans at some point in their lives have felt only half free and have wanted to get freer. That is another way of saying that this story of Black Los Angeles transcends what is local and what is black. It is a slice of American history for all Americans. The protagonists in my story were bound for freedom because most of them were leaving a dangerously unequal South for a potentially equal West. They understood that movement itself was a way to find liberty. But because Los Angeles offered better racial conditions, but not equality of opportunity, black Angelenos were not fully free to pursue their ultimate dreams and develop fullness of their abilities. What's more, the freedoms they did have in California were constantly under attack from whites who preferred a Jim Crow racial order in Southern California. Black Angelenos thus fought a double battle, laboring to attain those rights they did not yet enjoy, while seeking to protect the rights they already had. To be bound for freedom, then, implied more than just a decision to leave the South for the West. It also meant that black Angelenos were bound and determined to keep Jim Crow out of their new home and to make Los Angeles and the West a shining example of what America might yet become. I'll stop the reading there and talk informally for a few minutes. On the question, well, what did I find? It was a long journey. The first thing I found was that it was a much harder project than I initially envisioned. What I found was that Los Angeles then could be as hard to understand as Los Angeles is now. It was for me a very hard city to get my head around, to get a map of the city and its people in my head. It took years and years of just basics of learning about Black Los Angeles. I already knew about American race relations, but my knowledge of that was the basic Eastern view of a black-white scenario, and of poor black sharecroppers in the Great Migration moving north to Chicago and to Pittsburgh, other industrial cities in the First World War. So it was a harder task than I had envisioned. And then I decided to rewrite it, right as I was about to. I had written a book primarily for historians addressing historiographical issues that historians debate and have debated for years on end. And that was the tone of it. And somewhere after I got to Atlanta, I had what you might call an epiphany of sorts. to say, this is not the right book. This is not the right audience. Historians will get the arguments fine in their own venues. They'll understand how what I'm saying fits into all the conference debates we always have. But that is not who should be reading the book first and foremost. That is not who I should write to, because the story was too rich. The people I was studying were too profound. Their lives were too profound for me to limit the audience. And so I decided to envision as my audience a large classroom of freshman students, as I have often at Georgia Tech, who are willing to be interested in the past and their place in America. If you'll take the necessary effort to get them interested. And beyond that classroom, to the nation of readers who are interested in the past, the African American past, the Western past, the urban past. And so I rewrote it. I had such rich voices in memoir, autobiographies, oral histories, in the black-owned newspapers. Such rich voices that told the story, if I could just get out of the way. And so my new task began to be starting over and letting the voices of the community, this group of Americans, to speak. Of course, you can't just get out of the way entirely. That's just the truth of the matter, is that a historian has to write the thing. You have to craft the narrative. So it was a challenge, a reward, a blessing to try to structure the book in such a way that the voices of the people themselves are the key to the story, and I try to assume a place in the background while keeping the narrative clipping along. It's a very rewarding experience, very difficult, nearly broke my health, nearly wore me out, but I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. So what I hope that the book shows first and foremost is this community of people, their personal stories, which are so captivating and often painful and ultimately inspiring, and I'll talk about that inspiration later. Of course, many of the people in the story have UCLA tie-ins, which is just another reason for me to be glad to be here today, and particularly in the Bunche Center, because Ralph Bunche was such an important part of the community, such an important leader, such an important symbol of what America and Los Angeles might yet become. And of course, with the world in its current state of affairs, and enough said there. All I can think oftentimes is, I wish we had Ralph Bunche now. We could sure use him in the United Nations right now. Another major UCLA tie-in may be less familiar to you, and that's Augustus Gus Hawkins. Now, it won't be unfamiliar to those of you at the Young Research Library, and perhaps others who have studied his career. But his family came from Louisiana as well, although in the Hiskett Shreveport rather than Norwalk. But it sounded like a family not unlike your own, having not done too poorly in the South, but seeing the opportunities that might lie to the West. And Gus Hawkins became a political phenom in Los Angeles and later the nation. He write at some length about his election in 1934 to the State House in California, and then just mention toward the end his election to the U.S. Congress in 1962. He's still alive. He's still sharp as a tack. He's a great man. Second thing I found in the story was that the Western experience was really different. I guess I expected and perhaps hoped it would be different, but it was a lot different. For one thing, the industrial jobs that exploded in Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cleveland becoming Alabama West was Alabama North, I'm sorry, Alabama North, big difference, was the nickname for the black community in Alabama, in Cleveland. Can you edit that part of the tape? Because so many people left. Alabama went straight north to Chicago, just like people in Louisiana and Mississippi who needed out of a sharecropping situation or a bad situation, took the Illinois Central on up to Chicago. You had that World War I Great Migration movement, and blacks left the South in astonishing numbers, and the migration would continue through the 20s, to some extent the 30s, and then explode again in this so-called Second Great Migration of the 40s. The migration to Los Angeles was a different migration. I call it the modest migration, not the great migration, because it was more of a slow, steady build-up of families, generally who had made some success in the South and now saw that they were at great risk of losing that, or that their families were at risk. If you were black and successful in the South during the Jim Crow era, you put yourself at risk. Because if you rose too high, the white folks would make sure that you came down, and sometimes with the ultimate violence. And so what you got in Los Angeles, I argue, is a kind of middle class, a smaller middle class community. It took more resources to come west. Just to give you an example, if you leave New Orleans for Chicago, that's about 800 miles. If you leave New Orleans for Los Angeles and you go about 800 miles, you're not even out of Texas. All right? The far west is a long way to go. And a ticket from Atlanta, for example, you had a lot of movement from Atlanta to Los Angeles. One ticket was about $40 at the turn of the century. So if you're moving a family of 5, I'll let you do the math, but you have to have had some pretty good savings in the turn of the century South for an African American to go west. You couldn't just hop a freight car. You wouldn't survive the desert on a freight car. You paid a ticket, you got there. So the community, although certainly not all middle class, and I use the term middle class throughout the book in a very broad range, as the book will show. It was a different sort of dynamic. That's one reason the West was different. The second was that people who came west adopted this notion that the West was different, that there was a Western ideal. And the Western ideal was that this was the final place where America would really be America, where everybody could rise up by their own merits with enough push and vigor and attitude. That was the notion held to, of course, by any white booster you ever heard from Dodge City to Los Angeles. And Western boosters could outdo just about anybody for boosting their own cities and the virtues of the West, except perhaps Southern boosters. But in the West, black leaders took up that notion. We are out West. The West should be the land of equality. And it's not. so that they could turn that rhetoric to the white establishment and say, as a kind of civil rights rhetoric and leverage, you're not living up to the Western ideal. You believe in the West as a land of equality. We believe in the West as a land of equality. Why aren't you living up to your part of the bargain? Because we don't have equality. At the same time, the black community in Los Angeles had a second region always in mind, and that region was the South. They almost always spoke in terms of the West versus the South, as if this was the last great struggle to see which regional ideal would define America. The Jim Crow South, with its disfranchisement, its Jim Crow, its unchecked lynchings, or the potential equality of the West. And so, although we no longer think of Los Angeles as a Western town, I guess we think of it, well, I'll ask you that. I might open that to discussion later. Seems like its own global city now, not a town of the West. But they thought of it as the West, and they were always fighting for a broader expansion of Western equality, even as they fought against the intrusions of Jim Crow, which often came to town in the form of white Southerners who moved out west. So that if you were from New Orleans and you moved to LA and you found that it was indeed freer, better opportunities for home ownership and good schools and the like, less social hostility, better racial conditions. But pretty soon you'd say the South isn't free enough. I mean, the West isn't free enough. I'm sorry, Alex, I'm stumbling over my words. The West is not free enough. But you also had white Southerners coming west and saying, as they looked around in the bewildering racial diversity of LA, and they would say, there's not enough Jim Crow here. This town is too free. They should take the Mississippi example. And people would say this from the southern white community quite openly. And so there became this struggle of region versus region. Finally, and this is my last point, and then we'll open it up. I found something that I didn't know I needed. And that something was hope. I confess to you on tape that I am a pessimist by nature. I do not wake up in the morning and think, man, the world can get better today. I think instead, who knows why, that if anything can go wrong, it probably will, and probably in the worst possible way. And I am profoundly disturbed by many of the current political trends in the United States of America, and indeed the world in 2005. So I'm not the person you want to come see for an uplifting discussion of the state of the world. So left to my own devices, I despair. But I'm not left to my own devices. Because I have people here in LA, Atlanta, friends and colleagues who do believe, and that helps. But we don't just have our present to draw on. We have our past to draw on. And so what I discovered in the end, and perhaps most importantly, in the Central Avenue community, was a spirit of tenacity, a spirit of hope, a spirit that said, no matter how bad things are, things can get better. And they were able to maintain that attitude even though they lost more civil rights battles than they won, time and again got slapped down by the system, and yet never gave up faith in a better tomorrow. And I think it's time that all of Americans who may be despairing of the future, and I think that is many Americans today, look back to the past on Central Avenue and say, here was a group of Americans who believed that America could be America. To borrow Langston Hughes' famous words, let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Here is a place that I, at least, can find hope. And my hope beyond that is that other people who read the book, whatever their background, whatever their disposition, will find the same sort of inspiration that I did coming away from this book. I thank you for your kind attention, and I will open the floor for questions even as I sit down. Thank you. Yes?
Within your research, did you find that the African American woman had more of a prominence in the political shaping during that time? I think it was Charlotte, a lot of that.
More prominent than men at the time, or I would say, or compared to today?
No.
Okay, at that time. Probably not. At least, if I would say, judging by community studies I've read of other cities in America, I would say that generally speaking, as one might expect, the men held most of the key positions of power. And I don't want to idealize the amount of female power, empowerment in the West. But it is true that there is something about the West, and we know this because almost all the Western states gave women the vote before the rest of the nation did as states. There's something about the Western states that allowed for more participation, active influence among women. I'm not willing to go to the mat for that. If somebody wanted to argue against it, it might. I would not say that Charlotta Bass and others had more influence than men, but it was very, very important to me to include the women leaders who were important leaders, just as a matter of course, since they were. This is not a book about gender. I don't do any kind of gendered analysis of what's going on. But there are a lot of women leaders, and so I try to tell the tale. But I wouldn't say that they are more influential, but I would say they have more influence than in other cities.
What about wealth? I think of the investments.
There's no. I'll just take a quick guess, quick answer. I think women had more wealth here because, two words, real estate. They could and did invest in real estate. Many became realtors. Now, women entrepreneurs who ran race enterprises, that was not too unusual throughout the nation, usually small-scale operations. But I think real estate made the difference, made a huge difference in the community overall, because African Americans were shut out from any of the, really good jobs unless they owned their own business, or became a professional in their own right, like Dr. Summerville, for example. But real estate was a big deal in LA then, even as it was now. And there was still more, there was a lot of open land, there was a lot of development, and a lot of African Americans were able to do well. Vera Jones is an example in the book. Vera Decker, what's her name? I said Jones. She was married for a while, Vera Decker. She rides into town from Texas in a Ford coupe, beginning of chapter something. Her dad bought her the car back in East Texas. Mom and Dad and the rest of the family were riding in a car ahead of them, and they were going out to LA. They had a sign on their car, Texas to Los Angeles. And Vera had just been given her own car as a birthday gift. Her dad was a successful auto mechanic, and he sent a young man along to ride with her to share the drive. She wouldn't give up the wheel. She said, well, this is my car, and I don't want to give up the wheel. So she drove every mile by herself. And once she got here, she stayed here. Her parents wanted to take her back, so she went out secretly married the night before so she could stay. Not go back to meet what she called Mean, Texas. She stayed, did well, became a real estate investor. Other comments, questions? Yes, Kathy?
Well, I was just thinking when you described her in terms of personality types, the sort of person who would be willing to leave, their heritage in the South and come out to a new place. I mean, is that kind of a Western sort of persona that might be a little bit at play there? Kind of a little bit of an adventurer, or I don't know.
That's you hear that in quite a few of the migration stories. And her telling, they stopped along the way, camped out every night. Her dad would shoot a rabbit, her mom would cook it over the fire, and she just thought it was the greatest thing, one big camp out. But I think you could over-exaggerate the adventure of the move, because the equation of movement with freedom was so deeply ingrained in the African American experience. Movement can lead to unfreedom, as in the passage from Africa to the Americas, the Middle Passage. Movement can lead to freedom through the Underground Railroad. So the very notion of exodus, of movement, to get free. Black slaves flocking to Union troops when they were coming to the South, forcing the Union to say, well, what do we do now? Which spurred along Lincoln's emancipation program. So I think part of it is just that movement's a part of the culture, and rightly so. But there are plenty of memoirs and oral histories that pepper it with that kind of Westerneering, adventuresome rhetoric. And I try to keep the Vera Deckers, Charlotta Bass's, and Claude Hudson's, John Somerville's of the story front and center, so that there are people. In the beginning of the book, I set up several migration families, and then I try to let those families thread through the entire story, and occasionally I'll bring a new family will come in, because there were constant newcomers. The tough part was who to leave out. There were so many great stories. When I began, I thought, I wonder if I'll have enough material to work with. But it wasn't long before I realized I had too much material to work with, or more than I can't tell everybody's story. You still, yes,
Can I don't really have any questions, but I kind of wanted to make a statement, and
Sure.
because we're on a lunch hour and got to get back. But your book was given to me as a gift from someone in Washington, D.C. And the reason was because we're relatives, and I grew up in this part of town that you're talking about. And so many of the churches and the places that are mentioned here, and I have not finished the book really, are very familiar to me. My family came here from Texas to Los Angeles, and I'm not going to give the year.
That doesn't mean you came back here.
But I really grew up on the east side of town.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that Central Avenue district, and my mother and her brothers actually went to many of those clubs there on Central Avenue, and so I'm familiar with that area. I am. And I wondered if I could just get you to sign this book for me, and
It would be.
unfortunately we have to take off because
Yeah, well,
get
maybe
back
we can just move to that, Alex, and then we can chat casually as we sign, because I know what a lunch hour means, and I thank you for coming and telling that. Just by using the term east side, yeah, come on up. Just by using the term east side, I know that you grew up over there. You have, here, why don't, I brought this pad, so if you want it personalized to you as a name, then you can write that down. If not, I'll just sign it generically. But I don't spell well, and I don't hear very well. So that's
But you
why.
speak fine.
Thank you. Is that our